anything on there that strikes people or that you want to share about? Just to get us hearing a bit from each other before we get rambling.
I mean, I have an answer for all three of those. Do you want me to answer them all?
I mean, if you want to, whatever you feel like sharing.
Okay. Well, I was first aware when I was probably 4. I had a great uncle that was deemed mentally retarded. And he was, in a home and all that stuff and all that. And he had a lot of issues that, required him to get like medical things done so that he wouldn't hurt himself. So, and I had, being around him was very awkward because I didn't know how to be around him. And my parents didn't really do a very good job of like introducing me to it, and and it wasn't really until my sister was born that I was actually faced with it personally and in my life every day. And my sister is fantastic and amazing, and because we got to grow up with her, it became normal, and it is normal, and I love her more than anything in the world. And like, it's so weird how people who aren't around it are so turned off almost by it, and yeah, so but yeah, like I don't know, it's very normal to me.
And I think that's an important story. Thank you for sharing that, because so often, and this is less prevalent now than it was 20, 30 years ago, although the president last week talked about building more institutions and putting these people away as a way to protect people from weapons death, which that reinstitutionalization language undoes a lot of the normalization that's happened. But for many people, it's really not a normal experience until you have someone you know and you love and is part of your family. Because people are often in group homes, sometimes in full-on institutions, often limited in how they're available to meet and connect with society. And that creates for a lot of people that sense of stigma and different, kind of like your uncle. But then that personal knowledge means a lot. Anybody else have a piece that they wanted to share as an opening entry point into this?
I think something that's interesting is, what was the word you used yesterday? Not instead of visible and invisible.
Apparent and non-apparent.
Apparent, yeah, non-apparent disabilities. Like, I think I had a psychiatrist that I was going to, and they're like, yeah, anxiety can be a disability, and no one ever told me that, I guess, and so like becoming aware of things like that. And then with the girl that I nanny across the street, I've known her since she was really little, probably like 6. But she had severe brain damage growing up. So spending time with her over the last couple summers and throughout the year, I mean, our bond was just really close. And so when I go places with her and to see other people interact with her differently, it can be really frustrating. It's great when they're accommodating to different things, but sometimes they don't challenge her, and what she really does need is the challenge, and they'll dumb down their sentences for her. I'm like, no, she understands you, like, and so it's kind of frustrating, but it definitely makes me more aware of other people.
I think I resonate with that. My experience with people with disabilities that I knew had disabilities was pretty minimal outside of the occasional social interaction until my first internship in grad school, when I was assigned as a student chaplain to a state facility for adults with developmental and physical disabilities, and getting to work closely and have people with disabilities as my coworkers. And these were mostly severe profound disabilities in the scaling of that era. And be friends with them. It was that kind of having that connection, and then seeing their families come in. And some of the things that I was at that point being trained not to do, but that I would see families do, were the baby talk, the high voice that we listen to a little child. I mean, things that are part of that unintentional, but that web of ways in which a lot of mainstream culture will infantilize or otherwise reduce the humanity of folks. Usually not poorly intentioned, but things that we do or that we dealt with in part of our discomfort and part of social norms and parts of all kinds of things. Well, thank you all for getting to dive into some of that. I want to begin. There we go. So really this has been to look at the history and implications and bring it into the campus level towards the end of the disability rights movement, how that has evolved in American society and the U.S. society in the past 50 years at most. And for me, my real deep awareness was in that moment of that internship. Omni Day, for those of you who don't know, is one of the ways that I walk in the world. This was started by some students about 10 years ago that resonated with my own identities, and there's actually a blog that I don't keep up very well that Skylar and her wife made for me. But stories are part of what I do. So 3 stories that are part of my journey with this. The one close friend that I had with a disability, it was a very visible disability before that internship, was a fellow student. His name was Dan. He passed away about 6 years ago. Dan was the only wheelchair user on campus, which is not too uncommon of a reality to just have 1 or 2 folks who make use of a wheelchair to get around. In Dan's case, he had a rare form of a disease that was causing his, I can't remember the name, but it was causing his body to slowly shut down, and he should have died before he was 18. He lived until he was 33. As a student here, he was already paralyzed from the waist down and had limited hand and motor control. Dan was a year ahead of me, and we met through an orientation. And one of the first things that I saw was we went to Campus Films. The first week those were up and running. It was still in Roush back at that point. And there was not an elevator in McIntyre at that point. So anytime that Dan wanted to go to Campus Films, he had to call security, and 4 security staff would carry his chair with him in it down the stairs in McIntyre so that he could participate in the life of a student. I'd never thought of that before. Dan will go back on the story. Second story, I come back my first semester on campus as chaplain. We had just built Harnett Hall. How many of you have spent time at Harnett in some way? Yeah, for most of us. You know those little elevator lifts that go from mid-floor to mid-floor? Does that make sense? So there's these little, sort of, you can barely roll a wheelchair onto them, lift it up a bit. Those weren't there when they opened the building. We at the time had a staff member who was the person who was running what's now SICE, who was reporting to me. I was in Wheelock at that point too. But she was running the Community Involvement Action Center, CIAC, which some of you have seen boxes and things that still have that on it. Jack was phenomenal. She is an activist. She's been retired for several years now. She's been on the Tacoma City Disabilities Commission and really knows her law. We were taken on a tour as the pro staff and student affairs through Harnett Hall, and we got in there, and they said, oh, you'll have to go around through Thompson and ride the freight elevator, because we forgot to put in the elevators, or lifts, and they didn't forget to, they just didn't even think about it. At that time, the City of Tacoma did not have a code enforcement person tracking disability access and ADA compliance. The Harnett Hall situation was one of those that changed that, because he had signed off on the building without thinking about it. So we had this amazing moment where on a tour led by our staff in the facility we built, our staff couldn't get to it except for the freight elevator. And that is not the way you want to welcome folks into a space or include them in the community. Last one briefly was several years ago for Logjam, the ASEP's leadership, and these are all graduated and long gone, decided it would be great if we had a full all-campus student body capture the flag contest, running all over campus, jumping over things. And I got to stand there at Logjam with a group of about 10 first-year students who were on crutches or otherwise not physically able to run and play, watching as they were excluded. And we had conversations. The argument was, oh, it won't affect many people, and they can watch and they can enjoy it. That was the way that our leadership at the student level recreated this ongoing cycle of Puget Sound struggling with inclusion in this particular way. To me, stories matter. Stories of the young person you work with, your sister, and your uncle. Being able to share those where we encounter them for those of us who either are or present as not disabled. It brings us into a space where we can learn from each other, we can hear our experiences, and we can begin to undo some of that unhumanizing, forgotten left behind kind of attitude that often permeates culture. This is not just UPS Biological Shop, that's just where I spent too much time. I will give a content warning for the next short video. This is a video that was produced on the development of the disability rights movement. It does feature video from the 70s and 80s that is upsetting. And I believe there is some brief nudity of folks who are institutionalized. I find it to be at least powerful and painful.
Can we turn off the...
Yeah, I was gonna, because yeah, the video is a little bit dark too. You can see what I mean. Well, okay. So just if folks need to step out, it's about a 3-minute video, so it's not long, but please do take care of yourselves. Oh, no, wrong one. Hey, technology.
Ed started his presentation by saying, a nice little old man came up to me and said, son, I'd rather be dead than be like you.
Well, that's exciting.
Ed said, what's the proper response to that? And I said, well,
Yes, I can do full screen. Almost technology success.
Ed started his presentation by saying, a nice little old man came up to me and said, son, I'd rather be dead than be like you. Ed said, well, what's the proper response to that? And I said, well, the correct response would be you.
An age of exclusion.
There was no right to ride on a plane, to enter a restaurant or a store.
You may be told you have to leave because people don't want to watch someone drool.
We were living under substandard conditions.
Not going to school, sitting on the ward all day, not being talked to by anyone.
It is a civil right to be independent in America.
The number one precept of the independent living had to be that we had to teach ourselves how to die.
All of a sudden, meeting there confirmed that things were changing.
You had to be politically active, and I think a lot of us came to that conclusion very quickly.
We have demonstrators in wheelchairs.
Ed used to say all the time, use your anger, use your anger, use your anger.
Once the nursing home got wind of our ideas of independence, things began to get ugly.
You become more disabled in jail.
Disability is allowed, it can be powerful.
Beyond charity.
We love you all. You are our inspiration.
People will want to hand you $1, sometimes hand you 25, hand back the $1, but 25 making you think about it.
Beyond pity.
And you realize that having a disability doesn't make you shrunken or less.
I didn't know that it was okay with me to fall in love with somebody with a disability, but I knew then.
When you're up against something that the world doesn't give a rat's ass about, suicide sometimes comes to mind.
As long as our government funds places that people would rather die than go, it's a great cost containment measure.
I get out of my wheelchair and I start climbing. Now so many that I had local, I had everybody, they say that it was the image of me was the final decision to get the ADA pass.
It's our story.
It's always a journey. It just always takes a lot longer than you think it should.
Free our voices. www.itsourstory.org.
Take a moment to process that a lot better.
Can you keep the lights off actually? So it's
Yeah,
Oh.
the text is a little hard to read.
Yeah, but
Like the red or the
yeah.
orange.
Thanks.
Yep. Reactions. Those may be people you're into or deeply profound. Things that hit you or stood out to you or story?
One of those facilities was the one that my uncle was in, and I visited once when I was very young. Probably the first time I met him when I was around 4, so I had no idea what was going on. And my parents kept like shuffling me through, trying to avoid everyone, and I don't know, it was just really disturbing to me.
Yeah, the imagery, having worked in one of those facilities for a year and a half, and volunteered in it, and one of what was considered to be the crown jewels of the Southeast, at least in terms of quality of care. I saw some of that, none of the worst of that, but some of it certainly. And those people became my friends, and though I were those people. But the experience for guests, for high school to try to get some basic awareness with, really have that kind of my end here. Any others? Yeah.
My friend's grandmother is just schizophrenia, and she doesn't like take her medication, so she like frequently visited John George, that's like the first day for this, and she was like her grandma doesn't really like people outside of her like close environment, and I remember her just saying like the environment in there, and like it's overpopulated and people are laying on the ground. And my friend, who was like my age, 21, and he had like a break in the car with his like grandma, and he just like wigged out. We don't know what happened, but like she had to call the police attention there, decided to calm him down, and we picked him up later. And I've never seen him cry before, and he was bawling, and he was just like, "This is not a place like you want to be, because we don't see how bad they're treated." And he was just telling me like what he's seen and how like he straightened up real fast. He just like was like, "I have to get home," but like it just surprised me because I didn't hear that from my friend's grandma, because she didn't really have the means to tell me.
And so that gets into some of the ways that across generations, because some conditions that we label as disability are things that are part of family stories and family lives, and that adds a layer. I wanted, before moving into some of the ADA and its content, thinking to a couple slides yesterday morning, and I'm guessing the conversations that I was able to be here for around race and identity, microaggressions, the systems that we're a part of, and the ways that those weave together. What did you see in that short video that what systems were present or active in those folks' lives? I mean, it's fairly obvious that ableism is like this whole thing, but what else came to mind or came into view in those little voices, those few voices that we heard? Yeah, Hattie.
It just struck me as really interesting how they depicted the young woman who was crawling up the young white woman who was crawling up the Capitol stairs, and then in the end, like it's a monumental achievement to have something like that pass through policy, but the fact that it's a young white woman who's making that action to be a final instead of the various other people who saw in the video suffering the consequences of the violence of the law and being in prison.
That's a really, really good point. And then the way she frames that, and I wasn't cognizant of these photos when the story was happening, but when I began learning this stuff 20 years later, 15 years later, her photo, her image is the one that captured the nation's attention. So there's that, what image was able, nothing at all against her, but it was the way her image was used in media to say, here is that. And that was a problem, in which if you looked at the demographics, especially around race, in a lot of those other shots, it was largely people of color, not largely, at least half, I would say, people of color, very different representation, but it's that image of whiteness that was able to achieve political change in America. So yeah, maybe that system. Any others that stood out? Yeah.
I don't really have a full thought.
Go for it.
I think one of the interviewers said that, I can't remember the thing, but she said it's a civil rights problem or something into that, and then later on in the video, I think she said that everybody has a right to be independent in America. And I thought that was so correct, because we get taught the civil rights movement, right, but never about this.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the pieces of the ADA is that it really was inspired by the civil rights or racial justice movements decades before. And the techniques when one of the early speakers talks about we had to learn to use our anger. We had to learn how to fight. That these were things that had been a piece of the rhetoric of the 60s and 70s around racial justice and getting towards that the folks in the ADA movement created really picked up and ran with. And there are a lot of folks who are still the staunchest and most powerful civil rights activists for accessibility are folks who make use of that anger and that fight and will cause all kinds of hell if things go poorly. Jackie, my former staff member, was one of those who for the city after the campus was incessantly trying to push for what's right. So let's move into ADA higher education and what is the ADA and how does it work in our context. So, hopefully recognizable photo. People have been here before. What do you see in this picture? Stairs. And this is where my friend Dan comes back in. His running joke about the campus in a very wry and sarcastic way was not about the campus films experience, but the fact that up until after he had graduated, and up until I think about 18 years ago, so fairly recent, there was not an elevator in Jones Hall. So Dan would always tell people when they came to visit campus, or friends and family, well, I can go down the ramp to put into the basement to pay my bills, but I can't go up to any other floor to see my professors or the president. We'll go to the theater performance. And design is a part of what matters, and a lot of the history of the ADA up until recent years, has been focused on physical accessibility. And we'll talk about the ADA expansion and how that began to, and then finally on campus began to engage the less visible or the less visible disabilities that we talk about a lot more today.
Well, and even like the elevator that is, another thing is like crammed way in the back. Last year I was sitting doing some work on one of the couches and I saw like a family. And I think it was a son or daughter was touring and was in a wheelchair. And the tour guide left them, but I heard them talking about it. And I was like, I feel really crappy. Like, it's like, oh my goodness.
Yes.
It also doesn't go up to the third floor.
Yeah, or the fourth floor.
Or the fourth floor. I forget there's a fourth floor.
I've never climbed the stairs up.
Yeah, I forgot to mention this. One of the other pieces of irony with our primary administration building that has classrooms and faculty offices is that Jackie's husband, David Droege, was faculty here before he passed away a few years ago. David taught in communication and theater studies as they were combined back then. And David's office was on the fourth floor, so Jackie never once in her 20 years working at the university could go to her husband's office to have lunch.
Just call him to say. I think you let Autumn play on the video.
Nothing, man, just them. I'm listening. Okay, fine.
We also only have one wheelchair in Jones for the entire campus, and I found that out because somebody's family was visiting and their grandma required a wheelchair. So we had to run around campus and there was only one. So goodness forbid if there's more than one person on campus that needs a wheelchair at a time.
Yeah. So yeah, these kind of pieces of history are not over. I lost my slideshow on my screen, so I can click. So here we go. So these are the realities that we have experienced here. People have fought for years. Previous dean of students, Mike Segala, because there wasn't any action moving forward on this, created a accessibility work group that Sarah Comstock and I began for him as the two of the three folks who started it up. And it began the process of, with his role as vice president, forcing the institutional leaders to have these conversations. That evolved into largely the work that's now SAA, which I know people have a variety of experiences with, but before that, the office had been disability services, and it was pretty much just signing papers without any kind of student support or outreach for students who chose to come and self-disclose. The resources have become significantly much greater than they were, and yet we still have a long way to go. So the ADA, 1990, civil rights style approach and focus on defining disability. And because I didn't print my notes, let me pull up some of that language on my email on this thing. So the basic areas that the ADA covers under the original 1990 version of it are employment, accessibility in state and local government, public accommodation, telecoms, and then the ever wonderful category of miscellaneous. In our context, in higher education, the one that's most frequently used is public accommodation. How do we engage in buildings and spaces that are, sorry, computer's doing strange things behind the scenes. How do we engage in conversations and resources in public spaces, Schneebeck, Kilworth, Wheelock, and in some cases in our classrooms, if there's guests or visitors, that can comply with the ADA because we fall under that public accommodation category. In addition, there is some degree, because of funding and of employment issues, around employment and state and local government. In 2008, there was an Amendments Act passed that is still the law of the land, and it's been tweaked here and there since then. This is where the shift moved from rights and making definitions to accommodation and inclusion. So instead of trying to focus on, you have the right to do this, it became how can we work with you and whatever your realities are to fully include you as much as possible in civic life and public life. In that is when the ADA was expanded to include not just physical disabilities, but the range that we encounter now and the ways in which we went from having the office that's now SAA serving a small handful of students with mobility issues primarily, and a lot of them people who had injured themselves in athletics or out climbing, to over a quarter of the campus population because of the increasing rise of students who carry various invisible disabilities with them, as well as the better recognition now through the ADA that these things actually we need to work with and try to accommodate and include. The definition, so as a campus we still have around a quarter, slightly more than a quarter, depending on the year, students who at some point in their 4 years at Puget Sound will make use or be eligible to make use of disability services, now SAA, student accommodation and accessibility, to request some kind of an accommodation. Nationally, as of 2 years ago, an estimated 54 million United States residents are people who live with a disability, at least temporarily, if not lifelong. The definition as found in the ADA is that a disability is a, quote, physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of the major life activities of an individual. So there would be the language of physical or mental. In expanded language, it is mental, psychological, or physical. What do you think are the major life activities that are covered by that? What are some of the things that you think of when you think of major life activities that might fall under physical, mental, or psychological disabilities? Or that might be impaired by?
Honestly, simple. I think even like simple things like getting out of bed, taking a shower, a bath, really daily, day-to-day things.
And a lot of those are covered. Things, if you are in a public accommodation, you have to have access to, if it's a daytime facility, to restrooms, to water fountains, to sinks to wash your hands after using the restroom, hopefully, that are accessible for you. Similarly, if you're in a hotel or in a publicly rentable overnight accommodation, then you are required to be able to have access to a shower and bed and space to move around the room to be able to.
Do we have that on campus, like wheelchair accessible, like I'm thinking like bathroom amenities in terms of like housing?
AL has one. AL has one garden level.
Yeah, there's a handful. And that was part of the argument with students when, just as Vivi was arriving, when the SDC, SJC were being designed and implemented. That was one of the reasons the students requested to have the fully accessible restroom in the SJC. Yes, SDC. Left and right. Was because there were so few of those, that would be a space that we could, within our purview sites, have as a resource if there weren't enough or if somebody didn't feel comfortable with whatever they had in their res area. One of the several reasons for that, but that was a piece of the conversation. Okay.
Also, I noticed that most of the sororities, we all have accessible restrooms on the first floor. So I live on the